I am a lawyer, but in the military, I'm not a lawyer. I'm this thing called a Green Beret. One of the things we do is help people with CID investigations. What they did was they sent information to the FBI that said she had been arrested or received into custody, when in fact she hadn't been arrested. She was never arrested, never charged, never taken into custody. We are trying to raise awareness of this issue because we think that in the event class action status is granted, we're going to need to get the word out to the entire veteran community and those still serving on active duty in the Army. About 15 years after the flawed investigations, they at the Pentagon held a press conference and admitted they were wrong, admitted they had made mistakes, but they wouldn't acknowledge exactly what mistakes they'd made. Army CID, had no business investigating civilians. And so my biggest message to anybody who might be listening is if law enforcement is investigating you and they want to talk to you, do not talk to them.
All right, welcome back to the Tim Teaches podcast. I'm your host, Tim McCoy. Today I have the absolute pleasure of welcoming Doug O'Connell, a retired U.S. Army Special Forces colonel and experienced criminal defense attorney with over 30 years of military service, including deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan with special operations. Doug's career has spanned counterterrorism, national security, and military justice. He's tried over 100 jury cases in state and federal court, defending individuals in complex legal matters. Doug is a fierce advocate for veterans and law enforcement officers, and Doug also serves the community, working with veterans and nonprofits and a little bit of work in your church, it looks like. So, Doug, I appreciate you joining me and taking time to share some of your knowledge.
Sure, thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So, I mean, Colonel, Special Forces, that's pretty impressive, especially 30 years. I kind of want to just have you introduce yourself and jump into a little bit of that.
Well, it wasn't 30 years of active duty. It was 15 years of active, 15 of reserve time. And it wasn't consecutive like that. It was a lot of back and forth, especially after 9/11. I first joined the Army right out of college. I had an ROTC scholarship. I was an engineer officer assigned to Fort Hood, just north of where I live now in Austin. That was the late 80s. And we spent a lot of time in the motor pool, which meant I spent a lot of time watching dudes turn wrenches in the motor pool, which was not what I had envisioned from, an Army experience. I joined the Army because I didn't want to go get a job, right? I wanted to go have adventure and see the world. And, that didn't pan out. And then the Cold War ended and we had the first big downsizing of the Army. And so I used that as an opportunity to get out of the Army transition. And I was trying to figure out, well, what am I going to do now? What's next? And decided I'd go to law school because I heard that was challenging.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up going to law school at Wake Forest in North Carolina. And in that town that I was living in, there was a reserve special forces unit. And I ended up joining that unit and liking it and liking the challenges and the types of missions. And so later on, I became Special Forces qualified and continued to serve. There were multiple times when I thought I was going to get out and I've had enough, like after I went to Iraq. But they kept luring me back with what sounded like interesting assignments, and they were. And ultimately, when it was all said and done, I had hung around for 30 years and I had enjoyed it. And at that point, I was facing a mandatory retirement. So I retired in 2017, and I've just recently started receiving the retirement paycheck, which is nice.
Yeah, well, congratulations on getting that money after so many years. You finally get to go do all the MWR stuff. And have you have you been out to Hawaii to like the Holly Core, taking advantage of any of those benefits?
No, but I was out there to represent an Army captain in one of my cases. So it occurred to me that my Army experience, they sent me to places like Killeen, Texas, and Iraq and Afghanistan and Northwest Africa. And I never saw or was stationed at places like Hawaii.
Yeah, me neither. No, I spent most of the time in the, so I did 13 years in the National Guard, and I was in the Oregon National Guard and then California National Guard. And after 9/11 was called to active duty and doing Homeland Security and stuff like that. And then also sent to Iraq in 2003. So you came back in, it looks like after 9/11, what kind of, was it 9/11 that was like pressed you to join back up, or?
Well, no, I'd stayed in. So
Okay.
on 9/11, I was in the National Guard. I was a Special Forces team commander, a captain. And I will never forget, when 9/11 happened, I was working as a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Austin. And we all congregated in the conference room to watch what was happening on TV. And so I remember the second tower coming down. I remember I was sitting to a dear friend who was sitting to my right, and she was crying because I remember feeling kind of numb, but she kind of was absorbing the magnitude of what we were watching live on TV. By December, my unit was mobilized and sent to Fort Carson. And once we got there, we figured out that we were there to plan for and train for the initial invasion into Iraq.
Yeah, and that was kind of my experience as well. Like watching the Twin Towers, being in the National Guard, you knew that something big was going to happen from that, and being in Special Forces unit, I could imagine you guys had a lot more. Like you knew you were going somewhere pretty quickly. What was that like to go? Because I'm a pro military guy and love the guys I serve with, but as far as like we were doing this whole Afghanistan thing, and then all of a sudden everybody shifts focus, and it's like we all knew we were going to Iraq for weapons of mass destruction, and how how was that how high up were you in the military at that point?
I was a captain, so not very high up. And I it was an incredibly weird time.
Mm-hmm.
I remember I had a serious girlfriend at the time. She's now my wife. I remember going home and talking to her about what this meant to me and her. And, she really wasn't tuned into my military service.
Mm-hmm.
She knew I was a lawyer. I think she thought when I went away on the weekends to National Guard drill, I was doing lawyer things. And she didn't, as far as she was concerned, it was a good break, time away. She didn't really understand I was a Special Forces officer or what that meant. And so I was trying to explain to her, this is what's going to happen. I don't know what the timeline looks like, but I'm going to be called to active duty and I'm going to deploy. And that means I'm going to be gone for, an extended period of time. And she was like, well, don't they have other lawyers that could do this? And so that started an education process where I had to orient her to, now I am a lawyer, but in the military, I'm not a lawyer. I'm this thing called a Green Beret. And anyhow, she turned out to be a supportive military spouse, something that I'm very thankful for.
Yeah. So you guys do your training for Iraq and head over there. What's kind of your missions? What were you guys tasked with over there?
Well, so initially each team in the battalion I was assigned to was attached to go to specific locations and link up with Peshmerga fighters, local insurgents who were they were in northern Iraq battling Saddam Hussein's army. in Kurdistan, or what some people might call Kurdistan. The timeline kept getting delayed for the invasion. And so finally, my special forces company was sent home, and the battalion commander I worked for asked me to come back and serve as one of his staff officers for the invasion. And so came home for maybe a month, 2 months, and then I was right back, sent back to Fort Carson and then Romania, and then infiltrated into northern Iraq via Romania. And so we were stationed in Kirkuk, northern Iraq, working with the Peshmerga, launched the attack on the 11 Iraqi divisions that were arrayed on the Green Line, the boundary between Iraq proper and Kurdish-controlled areas. As you know, that the Iraqi army folded relatively very quickly, and for a little while there, everything was calm until the insurgency started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a wild time. I ended up going into Iraq in, I think it was May, whatever day George Bush said that, mission accomplished, was the day we rolled in there. And so it was pretty calm for a while until about, I think it was right around 4th of July. All of a sudden we started getting mortars dropped on us all regularly, and, things started escalating. But the first couple months were pretty quiet. So, and you've worked in counterterrorism and with the FBI, and as a federal prosecutor, you have this huge background. You haven't written any books yet?
No, I haven't. No. Maybe one day when I retire from being a practicing attorney, I can have the time to do that, but haven't found the time yet.
No. I'm just going to kind of throw it out there how I found you. You're involved in lawsuits and litigation, and right now you have a class action lawsuit that you're working towards, and that goes into the military and the criminal investigation side of things. Can you kind of explain a little bit what that class action lawsuit is and how you kind of got involved with it? Because you are helping a lot of people, and you have been for a very long time.
Sure. Well, so first, it might be important to note that I'm primarily criminal defense attorney and a military law attorney. And so normally I'm representing people who get arrested for a violation of the law. Normally, the people that find their way to me aren't career criminals. They're normal people who you and I could be friends with, hang out with, nice people. Oftentimes, they're veterans who are still carrying the weight they brought home from deployment, from combat. And oftentimes they're self-medicating, and that leads to problems with the law, a DWI, a fight, an assault, those sorts of things. The other thing I do is I represent military service members, mostly Army. Again, that's who primarily finds their way to me. But I've represented plenty of other service members. And one of the things we do is help people with CID investigations. I was representing a sergeant named Denise Rosales. She got into a jam when she was deployed to Kuwait. They investigated her for renting a day room so she could throw a birthday party for her husband, who happened to be deployed in Kuwait at the same time with a different unit. And so they have the party, and they didn't really do a good enough job cleaning up. And so the cleaning crew was pissed off at them. And apparently they found empty alcohol bottle in the trash. And so that caused a huge uproar. The MPs and CID agents, I guess, didn't have a lot to do that day. And so they launched this massive dragnet. Anyway, long story short, my client fell under investigation, and they never proved any accusations, but what they did was they titled her, and that means they determined there was probable cause to believe she violated a military regulation or a law. It didn't stop there, though. What they did was they sent information to the FBI that said she had been arrested or received into custody, when in fact she hadn't been arrested. She was never arrested, never charged, never taken into custody. She was never put in an orange jumpsuit. There was never any handcuffs. It was a simple misconduct investigation that has turned into something massive in her life, because now she has this criminal history that shows she's been arrested. What's worse is there's no disposition on it. So potential employers looking at that would think there's still an open criminal case against her. In the course of representing her, I contacted the senior JAG officer in Kuwait who was familiar with her case and was responsible for her case. And I said, hey, was in fact my client arrested? And if so, can you send me all the, and I'm trying to simplify this, but send me all the documents that go with anybody who's ever been arrested. If the Army arrests you, there's a paper trail, right? And so I said, send me all those documents. Well, he admitted in email, I have this in writing, that no, she was not arrested. And so me being a former Army officer, I recognized that that JAG officer, a lieutenant colonel, in my opinion, had a duty to correct the record, because that's what military leaders are trained and responsible to do, to protect soldiers from unnecessary implications for somebody else's mistake. And that's on top of all his ethical duties as an attorney. Well, he wouldn't do it. And then we appealed to Army CID, and we appealed to the General Counsel of the Pentagon, or the Army that sits in the Pentagon. And they kept on telling me that, no, we're not going to change this. We don't care that she wasn't arrested. She's going to have to live with this false record. And by the way, if I created a false government record, that's a crime. I would be arrested. I would be prosecuted. You're not allowed to do that. And so I certainly can't understand why the Army would think they have the capability and authority to create a false record. So finally, after exhausting all these administrative procedures, they still wouldn't fix it. And so I thought, okay, the next thing to do is, well, let's file a lawsuit. Let's file a lawsuit, and it'll cost a $400 filing fee. It'll land on some assistant United States attorney's desk. He'll read it, and he or she will say, what do you mean she wasn't arrested? And they'd call the Army and say, was she arrested? Army would say no. And then she would say, well, fix it, because we can't defend a lawsuit where we did wrong. And that's, having been a federal prosecutor, that is the standard. So that was my assumption. And of course, I was wrong. And the government dug in and they bowed up. And so I said, well, if we're really going to have to litigate this, if we're really going to have to fight about it, let's make it worthwhile. And we filed the necessary motions and amendments to try to get this turned into a class action lawsuit, because after investigating it, we realized that hundreds and thousands of soldiers and veterans have this same burden hanging over them. They have a criminal history that says they were arrested when in fact they weren't. A lot of those people don't even know they have the criminal history because they haven't tried to buy a firearm, or they haven't been rejected from renting an apartment because of the criminal history, or maybe they applied for a job and didn't get the job, and the employer told them why, potential employer told them why. We know that there's thousands of people out there in the same situation. The Army is being, in my opinion, stupid about this, especially if you consider how dangerous the world is right now. Recruiting is down. And so why would you join the military if you know that they can do crazy things like saddle you with a false criminal history? What parent would encourage a child to join the military? In any event, the judge has not granted class action status yet. That's on the horizon. We expect he will. He seems upset with the government because at our last hearing, he actually asked them, why is it so important that you have the ability to create this record? And they didn't have an answer for the judge. So the battle continues. We're trying to raise awareness of this issue because we think that in the event class action status lawsuit or class action status is granted, we're going to need to get the word out to the entire veteran community and those still serving on active duty in the Army.
Yeah. It's a horrific thing that they've done, and it has ruined a lot of lives by titling or creating these false records. I myself was a victim of this. It's a different case, but thousands, 100 and something thousand people were involved in. It's called GRAP, and it was a recruiting program that was run by civilians. And, this was back in 2005, I believe. And, a lot of guys signed up and helped recruit, and we brought in tons of different people to enlist in the military. And then years later, 10 years later, all of a sudden you're getting a knock at your door by some CID agent asking you about some person you recruited 10 years ago. And you're just, and this was going on with thousands and thousands of people. And I mean, it was terrifying. I was involved with having that knock at my door. Nothing ever became of it, and 15 years later, I receive a letter that, oh, hey, we actually created this false record for you, and it's been removed. And I didn't even realize I had anything like that on my record. And, I was a reserve deputy, the sheriff's deputy at the time. And, I don't know why that didn't come to light or if it was after I signed up. But talk about stress and PTSD and looking over your shoulder because you're like, geez, what did I do to draw the attention of these people? When somebody shows up with a federal badge at your door, it's a terrifying experience, especially when you're, caught off guard. You don't really even know what this whole thing is about, and so I've followed along. That's kind of how I found who you were, is this Stop GRAP investigation or Facebook page. And, you're all over it. Like,
the thing that pisses me off the most about the GRAP scandal is, well, a bunch of things about that piss me off, but one of them is it's always the junior enlisted soldiers, for the most part, that get hemmed up. None of the generals and colonels who created that program and failed to supervise the civilian contractors, none of them paid any price. They all get to retire with their full benefits. It's always seemingly the junior people who are punished. The other thing that pisses me off is, about 15 years after the flawed investigations, they held a press conference where they at the Pentagon held a press conference and admitted they were wrong, admitted they had made mistakes, but they wouldn't acknowledge exactly what mistakes they made because they wanted to make it more difficult for people like me to sue the government. I won't ever forget listening live to that press conference because I felt that everything I had been saying about that whole program and the CID investigations were validated.
Mm-hmm.
None of that was proper. None of it was legal. All the people that participated in GRAP did so as a civilian subcontractor to the contractor. Army CID, had no business investigating civilians, even if they were part-time military, National Guard reserves, because of the Posse Comitatus Act. That whole investigation was a violation of the law.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of people involved never committed or had intention to commit fraud against the government.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had come back from Iraq. I was suffering from PTSD and not really working and was short on money. And this was a program that I was like, well, I know about the military. I can go out there and recruit some people and, and during that time, people were still interested in joining the military. So it wasn't that hard of a sell to get people interested and come in. There's signing bonuses but what if I had to do it over again? I love the military, but I don't know. I would question whether that's a route I would want my kids to go now, just based on that experience. I mean, it was horrific. It took all the pride that you had from your service and made you feel like you were some kind of criminal.
There were some documented cases of actual fraud. Meaning recruiters would tell a recruiting assistant, hey, contact this person and load them into your GRAP account. And then that recruiting assistant would give a kickback to the recruiter. So there were a handful of cases like that.
Yeah, but to hem up, I think, thousands and thousands of different recruiting agents, it's like, it was crazy to me. And but I got out of the National Guard in 2013 and, never looked back. I'm proud of my service and I love the veteran community. And that's why I do this podcast, is not specifically for veterans, but for law enforcement as well. Because those guys, I talk a lot about PTSD and suicide and stuff like that. There's not as much help out there as is needed for some of these guys. And so I just try to spread the word. But I know for me personally, that whole investigation really, really affected my mental health even worse. And it took a long time to realize, like, no, you're fine. You didn't do anything wrong. Stop worrying about it and move on with your life. But I know, follow that page, and there's so many people on there who, some went to prison, and some of those people, they claim their innocence.
We have cases where a defendant involved in GRAP was pressured into taking a plea bargain, pleading guilty to avoid a prison sentence, for example. And then years later, Army CID sends them a letter that says, oh, I'm very sorry. We now realize there was never any probable cause to arrest you or to investigate you. Yeah, that was such a debacle. You mentioned law enforcement and all the trauma that they absorb and carry around with them. That's another area where we do a lot of legal work. In my jurisdiction, where I live in Austin, Texas, we have a very progressive elected district attorney. I would say very, very far left district attorney. And he ran on a platform of prosecuting police officers. And so think about that. You're a cop trying to do the best job you can be. You're human. You're not perfect. Incredibly stressful job. And every time you answer a call, in the back of your mind, you got to be thinking, well, I could get shot and killed on this call. Or if the district attorney, who sits in a fancy office where he's very comfortable, decides that I didn't do something proper, I might get indicted. Mm-hmm. So it's a really tough environment here in Austin to be a law enforcement officer. Unfortunately, we have represented probably at this point 12, 15 police officers, well, probably more like 20 police officers since December 2018.
Wow. I mean, that's a lot of officers to defend. And that was kind of one of the reasons I got out of it, because of the liability. I'm in Oregon and it's a very liberal area, but you try to go out there and help people, and all of a sudden you make one unintentional mistake and it's like you're getting sued, personally, civilly, and losing everything you've worked hard for. And so to me, at the end of the day, it just wasn't worth it anymore. You want to help people, but there's better ways to do it until they fix the justice system when it comes to, I know they have protections, but it's not.
They're not adequate.
How did you went into law from, you're doing special forces on one side and doing criminal law. You were a prosecutor for a while and then went over to the private sector. How was the prosecution side of things?
I enjoyed it. It was, in my opinion, absolutely the best place I could have started. I started as a misdemeanor prosecutor, primarily prosecuting DWI cases and assault cases. The training was minimal, I'd say. The attitude was, we're going to throw you in the deep end and you're going to sink or swim and you'll figure it out. And I kind of respond to that type of education because I learn better by doing things. And so I tried a tremendous amount of jury trials as a young prosecutor. I got a tremendous amount of experience because of that. It was an environment where, because these were low-level offenses, if I bungled a case, which didn't happen very often, but I lost some cases, it wasn't the end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, losing the cases I lost was critical for my training and experience because, when you win a jury trial, then you just strut around the courthouse thinking I'm the man, and you don't really learn as much from it, right? But when I lose a case, I am reliving every second of that trial in my mind for weeks and weeks afterward, analyzing what I did, what I could have done better, so that, as a result, I learned quite a bit from that experience and got to be a better lawyer because of it. Later on, I went to be a felony prosecutor at the district attorney's office. And then eventually I was a federal prosecutor here in Austin. And about the time 9/11 happened. So on 9/11, I was working as a federal prosecutor. I deployed for a year. I came back, did some more of that. And then later they sent me to Afghanistan. Eventually, it was time for me to go into private practice. And the easiest path was to do what I knew how to do, which is military law and criminal law. Since then, we've had a lot of good success. And I have a partner that does civil law. I have a partner that does family law. I have two other folks that practice military law with me and another attorney that does criminal law. And so we have a small team of lawyers in our firm. Everybody is either ex-military or they are still serving as a JAG in the Army Reserve, with the exception of one.
Okay. You're a busy dude. So I got kind of a question. So if somebody's listening to this and they find themselves under the scrutiny of law enforcement or a prosecutor, or they're involved in some sort of situation, what would your advice be to your client? If somebody's listening to this and you're caught up in something, what's the number one rule for these guys?
So, how you mentioned, you said something to the effect of, when you were under scrutiny,
Mm-hmm.
You said something a short time ago about how you didn't do anything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And lots of us feel that way. And, if you're a military veteran, you're conditioned to answer questions and comply with authority. And oftentimes people believe they didn't do anything wrong. And so there is no risk in talking to law enforcement. And so my biggest message to anybody who might be listening is, if law enforcement is investigating you and they want to talk to you, do not talk to them. Be polite, be professional. Keep in mind that they are most likely a good person doing a tough job. And so there's no need to be rude, but don't talk to them. Don't answer their questions. And instead, simply tell them, I'm going to get with my attorney and they'll be back in touch with you. But don't answer any questions. And the reason that's important is you don't know everything they know. And you don't know the implications of what you're going to say and how it's going to impact you. Oftentimes, what a citizen says to law enforcement or prosecutors can be twisted to support their theory of the case. And it makes your attorney's job 10 times harder. You can always talk to them after you've talked to an attorney, but once you say responses to their questions, you're locked into those answers. And so nothing good ever comes from that.
That's excellent advice. That's what I was
You
hoping
know,
you would say.
would you agree as a former law enforcement officer?
100%. And there's like one case that sticks out in my mind. And I was just a reserve sheriff's deputy, so we're not federal. But and for people listening, it's not a crime to lie to, in Oregon anyway, to lie to a sheriff's deputy. It is a crime to lie to a federal agent. Those are huge differences, and a lot of people may not be privy to that or understand that. But I mean, we showed up to this guy went over to his girlfriend's house, bashed out all the windows and did a bunch of stuff, but we had no evidence to prove that, and we just went and knocked on the guy's door and said, hey, listen, she installed video surveillance. We got you on camera. We saw the whole thing. Just, basically cop to it, and, we'll take it easy on you. And sure enough, he just spilled the beans and told us everything that happened. And it's, part of me is like, don't say anything, but, there's no, law enforcement can lie to you too. A lot of people think that they can't. They can, and they do on a regular basis. And so I would agree with you 100%. Whether you've done something or haven't done something, do not speak to law enforcement without representation.
Right.
That's kind of my biggest take out of all the being in law enforcement, being under scrutiny, the whole 9 yards is, so you're not doing yourself or your attorney any favor. You also you do a lot of nonprofit work with veterans, and you have an organization that it does some fishing. Is that right?
Yeah, I help with a veterans fly fishing program. And by help, I mean, I'm the chief dishwasher and the chogi boy that helps the cook. There's other guys that are actually really good fishermen who guide the participants. That program happens every October. The big Boy Scout ranch in Cimarron, New Mexico hosts the program. And so it's up in the mountains. It's beautiful. It's 100% paid for. It's free. And, we do this once a year. All the participants have a great time. We're staying up in cabins and pretty high up in the mountains, fishing, 2 days of fishing, campfires at night, good meals, a lot of good camaraderie. And if there are veterans out there that think they might like to participate, they should reach out to me and we can talk about whether they're a good fit for the program.
Awesome. I'll post your contact information in there, and so people can reach out and get a hold of you. There's a lot of different organizations doing a lot of good things out there, and we definitely need it in the veteran communities, because a lot of guys are out there suffering in silence and not going out and being in a community. And I think that community is really what helps alleviate a lot of the problems that people find themselves in their life. If you have a good community, it's powerful.
I think you're absolutely right. And, for the small little program that I help facilitate, it's a fly fishing adventure, but it's really not about fishing or catching fish, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's about being in a beautiful place in the mountains with other veterans and sharing time together. And if you catch fish, that's great. But if you don't catch fish, then you're still going to have a fabulous time and get something out of that connection with the fellow vets that weekend.
Right on. Well, Doug, is there anything else you want to plug out there besides your law firm, which I'll throw that on the screen as well?
Yeah, if you would, I'll send you the link to the latest Fox News story about what we hope is going to be a class action lawsuit, so other folks can read about it. We tell people, and I realize you have listeners all across the country and maybe internationally. I like to tell people that if you're a veteran or a law enforcement or a family member thereof, and you think you need a lawyer, you're always welcome to call, and we'll help walk you through the analysis to figure out, well, do you really need a lawyer? Sometimes people just need to go home and apologize. Sometimes people need to stop spending so much money. But if you do need a lawyer and it's in our jurisdiction or something we can handle nationwide, then we're happy to help you. And if it's not something we can help with, either we don't have the state license for where you're located, we can help find a respected, trusted lawyer to help you with whatever your situation is. People can find us through our website. It's OConnellWest.com. So OCONNELLWEST.com. And, we'd love to talk to folks.
Awesome. Doug, you need to write a book because I guarantee you have a ton of stories and I'd love to hear some of them. I appreciate you taking some time out of your Friday afternoon to share some of this information. I guarantee you it will be helpful. I wish you the most success with the civil suit that you're working on. And I appreciate you looking out for veterans and for law enforcement officers. So thank you so much for taking the time, and I appreciate you, and we'll be following along.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I appreciate you.